Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Stephen Grossberg. He is Wang Professor of Cognitive and Neurosystems, Professor Emeritus of Mathematics and Statistics, Psychological and Brain Sciences, and Biomedical Engineering at Boston University. And today we're focusing on one of his books, the latest one, and I guess that Steve would agree with me when I say that it's probably his magnum opus, Conscious Mind, Resonant Brain, How Each Brain Makes a Mind. So, Steve, welcome to the show. It's an honor to have you.
Well, it's a delight to be here, and it's one of the wonders of modern Zoom that you're in Portugal and I'm in Newton, Massachusetts. So there we go.
Yeah, there we go. It's modern technology, right?
Yeah, which got really amplified greatly when COVID happened. That's when Zoom really took off.
Yeah, that's totally right. So to get into the topics here, then in the first few sections of your book, you get into how we tackle basically the brain, how we understand the brain, the mind, and the relationship between them, and how you can do it through several different perspectives. Mostly you focus on physics and psychology. So to introduce the topic, could you tell us perhaps, and also to add some historical background here for the audience, could you tell us how physics and psychology approach this issue, and historically when and how did they split in their approaches?
Yeah, well, at the in the late 1800s, three very great physicists, Hermann von Helmholtz in Germany, Clerk Maxwell in England, and Ernst Mach in Austria made seminal contributions to psychology and neuroscience. At that time, if you were interested in the structure of physical space and time, you would just as likely try to study psychological space and time. But so they were interested in understanding how the observed world, which is physics, develops side by side their analysis of the observer, which is us. But by the time we got to the young Albert Einstein, he didn't do psychology anymore. He just did physics. And I want to quote just a little thing that he wrote to his friend Queen Elizabeth of Belgium in 1933, which was much later, but this was his stance throughout life, that, quote, most of us prefer to look outside rather than inside ourselves, for in the latter case we see but a dark hole, which means nothing at all. So in the late 1800s, the greatest physicists did psychology and physics and some neuroscience, and then Einstein, who's at least as great, did only physics. And the question is why? And one main reason is due to the properties of the experimental data that Helmholtz, Maxwell, and Mach discovered. And that data has characteristics that I like saying are nonlinear, non-stationary, and non-local, whereas traditional physics used models that are linear, stationary, and local. So what do those words mean? Well, nonlinear means, in the simplest form, the whole isn't the sum of its parts. You know, you chop us up into parts and life is no longer supported. But nonlinearity more technically means that you multiply variables, you don't just add them. Linear means you just add stuff. Non-stationary means we're always evolving. From being babies, we develop quickly, and then we go on through lifelong learning. And non-local, in the sense that I'm using it, means that there are long-range interactions between many, many neurons in our brains, And that is because these interactions enable our brains to understand the context and the objects in which we experience the world. It's not just pixel by pixel in a painting. Our brains look at the whole pattern, which requires interactions. And the physicists just didn't have the concepts or the math to do it. And in fact, Helmholtz, who started out deeply interested in psychology and physiology, ended his life only doing physics. So maybe that's enough to get started.
Mm-hmm. And of course, when I asked you here about how people from physics and psychology, for example, think about or understand the brain, the mind, and their relationship, I was also, at least to some extent, alluding to the mind-body problem. So could you tell us what exactly is the mind-body problem and why has it been so difficult to tackle?
Yeah. Okay, well, when we think of our brain, which is a central feature in our body and the one that's relevant to our discussion today, we may think of the little gray cells of Hercule Poirot. I don't know if you like mysteries, but I always loved thinking about the little gray cells. But when we think of our mind, we may think about a beautiful sunset, a feeling of being in love, deep thoughts or poetry. And there's a huge gap between those two. And the question is, how do you bridge the gap? And that's what my magnum opus tries to do, as reflected by its title, Conscious Mind, Resonant Brain, How Each Brain Makes a Mind. How do we bridge the gap? And my book, therefore, tries to give a comprehensive and unified description of the main processes whereby our brains make our minds. And that can be done because there are vast databases that were accumulated in psychology and neuroscience since the time of Helmholtz, Maxwell, and Mach. So the problem wasn't, what am I supposed to explain? The problem was, how can I find any explanation of hundreds of experiments and which experiments cohere together? So in order to even begin this, you have to have an intuition in which data are probing the same underlying processes. And what are those processes? So, well, we start with perception, and at least two main ones, visual and auditory. I won't even talk about tactile. And that goes on to cognition and emotion and action. And we can't just be satisfied with discussing how that goes on in healthy or typical individuals. It's important to also understand, well, what happens when they break down, which they do, and can lead to many clinical disorders. And in the course of my work, I noticed that if there are certain imbalances or breakdowns in the neural network processes that I use to model lots of data about typical individuals in a principled and unifying way, then out popped symptoms of diseases as varied as Alzheimer's disease, autism, medial temporal amnesia, schizophrenia, ADHD, PTSD, auditory and visual neglect and agnosia, even what goes wrong with slow wave sleep, things which I never dreamed of. And so one of the main things to think about is, how are you forced into thinking about things you never dreamed you would know anything about? Mm-hmm. And more than that, our brains operate in cycles. There's a perception, cognition, emotion, action cycle where we're continually interacting with and adapting to a rapidly changing environment. So with this background, let's come back to the mind-body problem. Why are they so intimately linked. And one theme in my book and in thinking about mind-body problem is brain evolution needs to achieve behavioral success. So the meat, the little gray cells, the body part of it is intimately linked through Darwinian selection to the mind part of it. They can't be separated. So the book explains how multiple brain circuits and multiple brain regions interact to generate the behaviors that control our day-to-day activities. And mind is what you can most efficiently call an emergent property, an interactive property of these brain mechanisms. And even von Neumann knew that the intelligence isn't just in the local interaction, it's how many of them interact. So why my book is unusual is that most books are about mind or brain, but not about each brain makes a mind. And in this regard, I was lucky because I started my life's work when I was 17 years old. I was a freshman taking introductory psychology, and there was a lot of quantitative data about how we learn, classical data. Hovland, Hull, many other great American psychologists were into learning. And so my brain exploded, and I was driven into what became neural networks, including the main laws of short-term memory, medium-term memory, long-term memory that people use today to explain how brains make minds. So because I started in psychology and was forced into brain, I was able to make the link and then build and build and build with many gifted collaborators for 67 years. So it was a lucky start, but why my brain exploded, I can't explain. And and these are not traditional concepts from computer science, engineering, or traditional symbolic AI. Although now a lot of people call me the father of AI, because over the years when symbolic AI failed, the people in AI wanted to take over neural networks to be AI. Marvin Minsky was one of them. And anyway, so I'm called the father of AI because I introduced the modern paradigm in 1957. And along the way, you know, with all the discoveries that just poured out over these years, it's not just classical stuff, because I had to introduce new computational paradigms to link brain to mind. And I call two of them complementary computing and laminar computing. And complementary computing explains the nature of brain specialization. You know, we don't have independent modules, like you don't first compute edges and then shading and then texture and then depth. Rather, when we look at an object, all of these properties can be overlaid. We're looking at a textured, depthful object with contours, boundaries. Mm-hmm. And so there's a lot of multiplexing of properties. And so complementary computing was a discovery I gradually made. I didn't wake up one day and say, oh, let's assume the brain has complementary computing. No, over decades, I would try to explain more and more data. And in every one of them, there were complementary pairs of processes in a kind of yin-yang relationship, computationally complementary, until I realized it was a global design principle for the brain. Like I think we might come to it in a while, that visual boundaries and surfaces obey computationally complementary laws. The ventral Watt stream that does perception and recognition in our brain, and the dorsal Ware stream that does spatial representation and action, obey computationally complementary laws. And one of them, the Watt and Ware, is on a huge scale of anatomical organization. Mm-hmm. And the boundaries and surfaces are much smaller. So you have a multi-level representation of complementarity in all brain processes. And I mentioned lamina computing. And lamina computing explains how all higher forms of biological intelligence are explained by variations of a single canonical lamina circuit. I mean, some listeners may know that if you look at the neocortex that supports vision, speech, language, cognition, there are 6 characteristic layers and characteristic sublamina with characteristic feedback interactions and horizontal interactions. So bottom up, top down, horizontal. In all of these circuits, and one of the marvels of evolution is that specializations of the same canonical circuit can do vision, speech, language, and cognition. And that's very important when you think, how do we develop a sense of self? Because our whole cortex shares a design, and all the parts can seamlessly fit together into an emergent architecture that can be resonating as needed to do, everything that we do in our conscious experience. So I've always felt it was remarkable that such seemingly different behavioral competences emerge out of variations of the shared canonical circuit. And no less remarkable is that circuit supports different kinds of conscious awareness. And because all those circuits obey a similar kind of input-output scheme, so they can all be interacted, feed forward, feedback, etc., that supports consciousness. Maybe that's all I should say about that. Because we have a lot. You have a lot of questions you want me to answer.
Yeah. There's a lot there to unpack, and it relates to also to some of the questions that I have here.
Let me also say for listeners, I think, think of this interview as listening to a story. Everything in the story can be thought about and studied on multiple levels, but first get the gist of the story. Mm-hmm. And maybe as we go along, you'll ask me to flesh out things more, but your questions really ask me to flesh things out more. So I think we should follow the questions and then see what maybe needs to be added.
Of course. And so you've mentioned words like computation there, and I would like to perhaps clarify that a little bit more. So are our brains like computers? I mean, when people talk about brains as computers, when they use that metaphor, is it accurate or not?
Well, emphatically not. For starters, I just noted we need new computational paradigms like complementary computing, lamina computing. Moreover, traditional computers aren't conscious. So my work provides or offers a scientific solution to the mind-body problem by showing how, where in our brains, and even why, from a deep computational perspective, humans can consciously see, hear, feel, and know things about the world. And we don't just get conscious to serenely contemplate the beauty of the world. Rather, we use our conscious states for reasons I hope we'll clarify as we go along, because they are competent to control effective planning and action to realize valued goals. And so consciousness mediates between mind and the world of action. And so to do this, our brains are self-organizing, meaning we can learn by ourselves autonomously throughout life. They're analog, which means that the neurons can have values going from minimum to max and everything in between, namely shades of gray, much as you might see an achromatic image in shades of gray. And everything operates in parallel because everything about our intelligence is organized in terms of spatially distributed patterns of activation. So self-organizing, analog, parallel, but present-day computers are not self-organizing, and they're digital and serial. So the architectures are fundamentally different. My own belief is that as computers evolve and they get even more powerful, like, my iPhone is a supercomputer, we'll have systems that on the one hand may be dedicated VLSI chips that embody more and more of the kind of intelligence that humans embody, complemented by a lot of things humans don't do well, which digital computers do, like adding a million numbers in a fraction of a second. And that will be a very powerful tool when and if it happens.
And you've already mentioned their conscious awareness. How do we experience conscious moments of seeing, hearing, feeling, knowing, and why do things like perception and awareness matter here?
Well, I want to emphasize that although I've led the development of what I think is arguably the most advanced neural theory of consciousness, in the sense that it provides principal and unifying explanations of the most psychological and neurobiological data about conscious experiences, I never tried to directly understand consciousness. You don't wake up in the morning and say, hey, let's understand consciousness today. But instead, all the deepest insights about how our brains work concern one of the things I just mentioned, how they self-organize through childhood development. And do you have any kids?
No, not yet, at least.
Well, we have one daughter. Well, anyone who has observed little kids learn language, that's fast self-organization. And lifelong learning. We continue learning throughout life.
Yes.
Remarkably, my models of learning forced me, kicking and screaming, into insights about consciousness. And so my work on learning led to currently the most advanced cognitive and neural theory about how brains learn to pay attention, recognize and predict objects and events in a changing world, emphatically one that's filled with unexpected events, because that's what we got to do to deal with evolutionary challenges. And this is the theory I call adaptive resonance theory, for a reason I'll make clear in a moment. And all of the foundational hypotheses from which I could derive art have been supported by subsequent psychological and neurobiological data. And art has also provided principled and unifying explanations of many additional experiments. But for me, the bottom line is really that I was able to derive art, I say ART, A-R-T, instead of adaptive resonance theory. In 1980, in an off-cited article in the Journal of Psychological Review from a thought experiment. And this thought experiment is about how any learning system can autonomously learn to correct predictive errors. So this is all about autonomous learning. And the hypotheses of the thought experiment are just a few facts that are familiar to us all. And they're familiar because they represent ubiquitous environmental pressures on the evolution of our brains. So they're not something, oh, well, why should I believe that? You believe it because you've been living with it your whole life. And moreover, during the thought experiment, I never used the word mind or brain. Mm-hmm. So the thought experiment and the principles and mechanisms that come out of the wash are thus a universal solution to the learning problem. Wherever those hypotheses are used to derive their logical consequences, you'll get a system like ART. And the learning problem, which I didn't say one crucial fact about, lifelong learning implies that when I learn something, I won't just forget it right away, which is called catastrophic forgetting. For example, Ricardo, I never saw your face before, and now I'll remember it for the rest of my life. So I learn it in a second, I'll remember it for years. So I call this the stability plasticity dilemma, how any system can learn without catastrophic forgetting. Plasticity, because we experience incredibly fast learning often, and then stability, the fact that our memory of that fast learning can persist for a very long time. And let me just say, for those of you who know some popular current AI like deep learning, it experiences catastrophic forgetting big time in multiple ways. If we maybe we'll talk about a little later. Mm-hmm. So I think, therefore, it's remarkable, but that these results about learning without catastrophic forgetting is what led me to rigorous neural models of how we consciously see, hear, and feel and know things about the world. So I derived the models. I was explaining with simulation, parametric quantitative computer simulations, mm-hmm. with my many students and postdocs, all this quantitative data about seeing, hearing, feeling, and knowing. And then I realized all those parametric properties are properties of conscious experiences. So consciousness sort of came in through the back door. And the thing that all of these experiences had in common are resonances, which occur when there's excitatory feedback, bottom up, top down, excitatory feedback between pairs or greater numbers of brain regions. When they match their signals well enough to cause the active cells to synchronize, boom, 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 boom. And that's one reason why we have brain rhythms, but different brain rhythms support different processes, and sustain their firing long enough to trigger not only learning, but consciousness. In other words, the resonances and the requirement for matching are what dynamically buffer a learning process against catastrophic forgetting. And the remarkable thing is that the contents of these resonances match properties of the conscious experiences that they're learning to represent. That's why I call my theory adaptive resonance theory, because it's how resonances trigger learning that doesn't experience catastrophic forgetting. So the proposed solution on mind-body problem occurs due to a computational analysis of how humans and other animals autonomously learn in a changing world without catastrophic forgetting. And because the hypotheses and the thought experiments that lead to cognitive models like adaptive resonance theory, as well as cognitive emotional models, like what I call my COGM model, the cognitive emotional motor model, never mention the word mind and brain. My work and my book show how these models provide a blueprint for designing autonomous, adaptive, intelligent applications to engineering, technology, and AI. So if you want autonomous, adaptive intelligence, we already have the foundations of a blueprint for it for the future. In particular, my books spend a lot of time explaining how our brains consciously see the world. And that's not surprising because more than half of various mammalian brains are devoted to vision from, excuse me, early sensory processing up to visually based cognitive planning and navigation. In other words, we need perception and consciousness to be able to act upon the world by looking, reaching, and navigating in order to survive environmental challenges. So this link between consciousness and action, I think, is very interesting, mediated by learning that solves the stability plasticity dilemma. Sorry about this. I have had asthma for over 70 years.
Another thing that I would like to ask you about, and it's something that you also tackle in the book, is visual illusion. So how do they work, and what can we learn about, I guess, not only the visual system, but information processing by understanding how visual illusions work?
Yeah, I wish we were able to figure out how to show my PowerPoint slides. I'll try to use the words about what the pictures would have shown more clearly. So first, let me sketch why we experience visual illusions, which will also start to explain how they work. So let's start with the retina, the photosensitive retina. That's where light is registered before light signals all over the retina are bundled through axons, those are pathways, into the optic nerve to set pattern light from the whole retina up to the brain. Because of the need to form the optic nerve to carry the light signals to the brain, the retina has no photodetectors on the part of the retina where the optic nerve forms. That part of the retina is blind. And you might say, well, big deal. I don't see it. It hasn't caused any trouble. But if you look down on the retina, and I had a pretty picture to show you that, and if you get my book, it has all these pictures. It has over 600 color pictures. So everything I say is illustrated. Another part of the retina, not far from the blind spot, is called the fovea, F-O-V-E-A. That's where all of our high acuity vision occurs. And it's because we need the fovea to really see things clearly that we move our eyes several times every second with saccadic eye movements to point them to the things we really want to see clearly. Things in the periphery get fuzzier and fuzzier. And the blind spot is as big as the fovea. And now you might say, but then why don't I see it? And before getting into why, think about it. We couldn't look at or reach for an object that happened to registered where the blind spot is if we didn't somehow do something to make that problem go away. And that could lead to disaster. You know, leopard is leaping at you in the place where the blind spot would have seen it. Tough. So why aren't we aware of the missing visual signals due to the blind spot in particular? How do you complete the retinal representation so that we can look at and reach for things which otherwise might have been invisible? And one thing you have to deal with right away is our eyes are rapidly jiggling in the orbit. They're sort of microsaccades, and they're happening so fast and they're so small you don't notice it. But it's functionally very important because there may be a stationary object in the world, and you're stationary with respect to it, but your retina is jiggling back and forth around every edge of that object, and it's creating transient signals. And these transient signals refresh visual signals, which otherwise would fade. I like to mention Jurassic Park here. Did you see Jurassic Park?
Yes, I did.
Well, you know that famous scene where this guy is standing out of the car and T-Rex comes looking very ravenous. Mm-hmm. And they scream, "Stand still, he can only see relative motion."
Yeah.
And then T-Rex moves his head. It's relative motion and scoops him up in one bite. Anyway, the blind spot is stabilized on the retina, so it doesn't create transients, and so it fades. So it's not going to cause a problem in itself, but you still have an incomplete retinal image with a big hole in it. And so how do you complete that? And that is accomplished by multiple stages of completing boundaries across the hole, mm-hmm. and filling in with surface brightness and color. And it takes several stages to do it. And I call processes whereby incomplete representations are completed by multiple stages of processing a hierarchical resolution of uncertainty, because when you're done, you're going to get completed boundaries and completed surface representations, so you don't know there was a hole there. Mm-hmm. But then that raises a deep question. How does the brain know at what stage the cortical representation, say, of a surface representing your face is complete enough to control looking at you or maybe touching your nose? How do you know what stage? Because it took a lot of stages. And you don't want to use a stage that has an incomplete representation, because then the leopard could leap at you through your blind spot.
Right.
And the answer that I propose is that a resonance with a completed surface representation and the next processing stage, surface representation, next stage, lights up the surface representation, makes it consciously visible, and then we use the conscious representation to look and reach. And so the hierarchical resolution of uncertainty created the need to have some active process light up the completed representation. And I call this a surface shroud resonance, mm-hmm. because spatial attention focusing on the surface is called an attentional shroud. And I predict it occurs between a pre-stride visual cortex V4, in other words, there's a hierarchy of cortical stages It took several stages to complete the surface, and the posterior parietal cortex, which is known to support spatial attention. So V4-PPC, I predict, supports the surface shroud resonance, and there's a lot of data supporting that. So getting back to the original question, what's a visual illusion?
Yes.
If the boundaries that are completed do not contain expected surface brightness and colors, then we say we're looking at a visual illusion. The truth is that almost everything we see is a visual illusion in the sense that we're completing boundaries and surfaces, not only over the blind spot, also over the plexus of retinal veins that covers the photodetectors. In addition, we're compensating for variable illumination. We're not seeing the illumination gradient. So the final representation of objects and scenes are visual illusions. But we only say, oh, that's a visual illusion if the color isn't what we think it should be based on our experience with that kind of boundary. So everything basically in vision is an illusion, and the ones that look funny, we call illusions.
Okay, but about those ones that look funny and we call illusions, how does understanding how we experience those connect to our experience of art?
Well, here I would have shown you several pictures that would have been for people listening. We weren't able to figure out how to link my PowerPoint to the Zoom. I've done it in the past, but I think the software changed or something. I don't know. First, I want to say a little bit more about boundaries and surfaces because they are the general functional units of how we see. That's an early prediction of mine that various people then supported psychophysically. So there's a wonderful illusion that it's painful to me not to be able to show it to you because it's going to be so hard to explain. It's a certain kind of Kanitsa square. Gaetano Kanitsa famously introduced lots of visual illusions. He's a very great Italian perceptual psychologist who died some years ago. In this illusion, he takes circles and he'll make part of the circle black and part of it light blue. And he'll have concentric circles so that the black-blue interface is horizontal. But he'll make a Pac-Man out of it, where the black part has a Pac-Man shape. These are all black lines. And then there's a little quarter of it, which is the blue parts, which have less contrast. And he'll do 4 of them. 1, 2, parallel to each other, like oriented. 3, it's hard to do, but it's backwards. So we'll have pairs in a row and then pairs one on top of the other.
Right.
And so if you look at where the black and blue interfaces occur, they all line up to form an illusory square. And my book has it in. I don't know if you can see it.
Yes, yes, I can. Yes.
So you see, the point is that because of the strong black boundaries inhibiting the weak blue boundaries, that's enough to make the square form. Yeah. And it's also enough to let surface color pour out of the broken blue boundary to fill in the entire square. Right. So what you see is a blue square neither the blue nor the square are in the image. But what this illustrates, and that's why it's such a lovely example, boundaries are completed inwardly between pairs or greater numbers of inducers in an oriented way. That's how you complete the square. And the blue color that spills out of the little blue broken boundaries spreads in a unoriented way to fill in the square. So the color spreads outwardly and unoriented, and the boundaries are completed inwardly and oriented. And so you could see from this outward, inward, oriented, unoriented, a sense of what I mean, that boundaries and surfaces are complementary, yin and yang. Of course, you can't be both oriented and unoriented, and you can't be both outward and inward. And without both of them interacting, though, you don't see anything. And so you have these parallel cortical streams that are doing complementary computing and then interacting to overcome their complementary deficiencies. And there's one more big property of boundaries and surfaces. For starters, we can consciously see surface brightness and color. We see qualia, but we can't consciously see boundaries except when they separate surfaces with different brightness and color. Boundaries are invisible. It's called the offset grading.
Yes.
Okay, so all I've drawn is horizontal black lines, but usually you can recognize that there's a vertical boundary of some kind between the ends of those lines. Can you recognize that?
Yes.
So, but the boundary is invisible. Okay. All boundaries are invisible. The only reason why you'll see color is because if you create, let me think, if you can see this, whoops.
Yes, I can.
This is called the Ehrenstein disk. All I drew were black lines. It completed a roughly circular boundary, perpendicular lines.
Yes.
And then at the line ends, there were little black-white contrasts that were little brightness buttons that filled in within the boundary, the circular boundary, and makes it look brighter. Do you see it looks brighter?
Yes, I see it.
Okay, so that's a case where because the color can't escape, it makes for a visible brightness difference. But here, the color can escape because it can flow all out of there and spread uniformly on both sides of the vertical boundary, and so it's invisible.
Yes.
So I also, let me show you, I think I want to show you a very famous picture that's a lot of fun. Let me see. This is a famous picture.
Perhaps just please move it a little bit away from the camera because, okay, like that. Yeah.
I don't know if you can see.
Yes, I can see.
At first, it looks just like splotches of black on white. But if you look at it for a while, you can see a Dalmatian dog in snow.
Yes.
It's hard to do. The image all the way to my right is the Knizia square. I don't know if you can see.
Yes, I can see it.
And right next to it horizontally, what's called a reverse contrast Knizia square. Now the Knizia square, just like when I made that circle with the lines, it looks brighter because the Pac-Man, the four Pac-Men, create square boundaries,
Mm-hmm.
and then they put bright contrasts inside, which fill in the square and look brighter. But if
Yes.
you look at the one right next to it, it has two black and two white inducers on gray background.
Yes.
And there you can recognize that there is a square, but the gray inside and outside of the square is the same. So it's visible. So in the case of the reverse contrast kin, it's a square. I'm so sorry, I should have just made.
No worries. I can edit this.
Yeah, so you can consciously recognize a square boundary that you don't see. Anyway, many artists knew instinctively about these things, including Matisse, who I love. And Matisse used to like writing that he didn't write all boundaries are invisible, but he painted with color splotches, and knowing that the boundaries would be completed to create a scene. And one of my favorites is the roofs of Korea.
Leave it like that, please. Yeah.
Yeah, he painted that in 1905.
Yeah.
And if you see it in my book or on the web or wherever, you'll see that there are a lot of color splotches, but they're arranged in a way that invisible boundaries join them and create surface representations of objects. So let me see if I can get a schematic of that.
Yes, I can see it now. Yeah.
You see the splotches create amodal boundary groupings, which then capture the splotches into surface color.
Right.
So anyway, that is one link between art and illusions. And I discussed the work of 14 different artists, showing how they all instinctively exploited different properties of how we see. I mean, just consider like the Impressionists like Monet in pointillistic painting or Seurat. How these little points of color arranged in an appropriate way generated emergent boundaries and surfaces that you can interpret as a beautiful scene. So my book spends a lot of time showing how different artists and artistic movements generated painterly percepts that we understand often as scenes and objects. Even, and like how you get effects of three-dimensional curvature in a 2D painting. And one of the big things my book explains is how the way our visual system adapted to the three-dimensional world, those same laws automatically enable us to understand paintings, Zoom screens, movies as 3D objects. I'm not seeing you like a pancake. I'm seeing a frontal view of a three-dimensional face.
And so we've been talking here a lot about the visual system, but how do we go from seeing to recognizing and also then to predicting the world?
So first, let's distinguish seeing and recognizing. So seeing, we open our eyes, and if there's enough light, we'll see. It could be unfamiliar or familiar. So seeing is a general purpose process, but we only recognize familiar things. So recognition requires prior learning of recognition categories for objects and scenes, so that these categories would selectively fire after learning in response to the objects and scenes that we've experienced before. And that raises the question, how do you learn a recognition category? And I already noted that adaptive resonance theory, or ART, explains how we learn to recognize stuff without experiencing catastrophic forgetting. And one thing I didn't say about learning in art, I said it enables us to pay attention, but what we're learning as we're learning categories that can be used for prediction is what are the critical feature combinations that are going to predict successful action. How do we suppress the irrelevant outliers? And when you study adaptive resonance here, you see how over learning trials, outlier, irrelevant features get actively suppressed, and you gradually converge. It can be very fast. It depends on the complexity of the problem. On a set of critical features in the activation pattern that, the top-down expectation is lighting up.
Yes.
And it's those critical features that go into the bottom-up adaptive filters that choose the category. And in the top-down expectation that the category reads out to focus attention. And so the critical features enable art categories to be associated with predictive consequences. And different resonances then support seeing and recognizing. I mentioned a surface shroud resonance supports conscious seeing, and the shroud is in posterior parietal cortex. The surface is in V4. When that resonance occurs, it propagates top down, all the way down to lateral geniculate, all the way up to prefrontal cortex. And because of what's called the art matching rule, namely how we pay attention, it selects the critical features that we should be looking at. But then the feature category resonance, which goes into the what stream, recognition and perception stream, that supports conscious knowing. So that when a surface shroud resonance and a feature category resonance synchronize, when I look at a familiar person's face, I both see them and know who they are. And I had a nice picture of that. But if you're interested, anyway, about my book, if you are interested, I should say this because, you might think it's such a big book. If you buy it on Kindle, it's $15.
Mm-hmm.
And if you buy it from Amazon, it's about $30. It would have cost over $100, but I worked very hard on the book, and I want the people who were interested to be able to afford it. So I asked Oxford University Press how much of my own money I had to give them to bring the prices down. So if you get it, it's cheap because I subsidized it.
Well, thank you so much for that. That's very generous. I guess that people will be.
How much did it cost in Portugal? Yeah, I don't know how you use euros in Portugal.
Yes, I think it cost around I don't know, 30 euros. I guess I order it from Amazon Spain. So
yeah, so that's not that different from $30.
Yeah. That's right.
Well, thank you for buying it. So should we move on?
Yes, and I was going to ask you now, actually earlier you've mentioned, for example, your cognition, emotion, motor model, but how do you look at the relationship between emotion and cognition?
In brief, cognition embodies what we know about the world.
Yeah.
And emotion embodies how we feel about what we know. And it's emotion that gives value to what we know.
Mm-hmm.
And here another resonance occurs between our cognitive art-like representations and our emotional representations. So the art-like ones are in places like infratemporal and prefrontal cortex. The emotional ones are in places like the amygdala and hypothalamus. And when there's a resonance between cognitive and emotional representations, that combines what we know with how we feel about it, and the feedback from the emotional representation is called incentive motivation, not only to pay sustained attention to something that we currently value, but it also gives the motivation to release actions
Mm-hmm.
to realize goals about things we value. So, if I see my wife's face a little way from here, I'll feel all the good things I feel to her and the motivation to approach her.
Mm-hmm.
So, a cognitive emotional resonance sends positive feedback between the cognitive and emotional representations.
Mm-hmm.
So, just as a current object or event can trigger an emotion, an active emotion can select and focus attention on objects and events that are compatible with that emotion and that can help us achieve, you know, um, results that are compatible with it. Where an emotion could be hunger, and
Yeah.
we just want to go have lunch. So, how to notice, desire, attend, and eat that ice cream cone. It's
Mm-hmm.
all wrapped up into cognitive emotional resonances and their output pathways. Um, so the cognitive emotional resonance is a different kind of consciousness because it links, for example, um, to surface shroud resonance. Well, I think we're going to talk about that in a moment. Maybe
Yes.
on.
I mean, these different kinds of awareness that we have, and we've talked about some of them, how are they then integrated into what we experience as unified moments of conscious awareness?
Yeah, so for that, multiple adaptive resonances synchronize. I mentioned two of them that could. But so example, during a conversation with a friend, we might be synchronizing surface shroud resonance to consciously see them, stream shroud resonances to consciously hear them, feature category resonances to consciously recognize what we're hearing,
Mhm.
cognitive emotional resonances to consciously have feelings about what we're discussing, and then what's called item list resonances to consciously understand the conversation because they're supporting things like working memory of sequential sounds that form language phrases and sentences. And all of them come together to enable us to act appropriately during the conversation. So it's not
Mhm.
just a single resonance, there's a continually evolving series of resonant states as stuff keeps happening.
And so we've already talked here about the relationship between cognition and emotion. I would like to ask you now specifically about the prefrontal cortex. So in all of what we've been talking about here, does the prefrontal cortex play a special role?
Well, I'm going to want to show you a figure of that for sure, but
okay.
But first, let me say it carries out or controls many of the higher cognitive, emotional, and decision-making processes that define human intelligence, as it's also controlling release of actions aimed at achieving valued goals. And as I just mentioned, one of the things prefrontal cortex has, it has working memories that can generate what I call list chunks or list categories, like words, sentences, phrases, thoughts, that can sequentially determine what's appropriate to do in a given situation. So it's not just one thing. And it enables us to generate behaviors that are flexible and adaptive, notably in novel situations, and to suppress ones that aren't by using this contextual knowledge. Can you see the 7 regions on top in red and green?
Yeah, I mean the green, it's not perceptible here, but yeah, I see the 7
Well, there were
figure.
7 regions on top. They're all different regions of prefrontal cortex. And basically, when you put together all the models into this larger neural architecture,
yes,
it explains how the prefrontal cortex interacts with cognitive, emotional decision-making processes to make contextually based decisions about what to do or think next. So you got to understand how working memories work and a whole series of things we won't discuss much today.
So earlier you've mentioned learning, and I want to ask you a little bit more about it, because actually in the book you also explain why we need to understand learning to then properly understand consciousness. And you distinguish between 2 different types of learning: perceiving and knowing versus moving and navigating. How do they differ from one another?
Right. Well, so I briefly mentioned before that perception and cognition are represented in the wad or ventral cortical stream. And then a spatial organization and action, including navigation, are represented in the where or dorsal cortical stream. And they obey computationally complementary laws. I'm going to just say in words what they are, and then it may be that one of the copies I was starting to make of my PowerPoint was of that, and I can actually show it. I'll run to my other study. So perception and cognition use excitatory matching and match-based learning. What does that mean? So if I read out a top-down expectation, I'll prime the system for getting ready to respond more vigorously to an expected event. Oh, you're here. I recognize your face faster. So that's excitatory matching. And match-based learning means that you only go into adaptive resonance if what you're expecting and what you're learning about are close enough together so you can suppress stuff and learn a better and better critical feature pattern. So the learning is excitatory, it's match-based, and the matching excitatory, but navigation and action use inhibitory matching and mismatch-based learning. What is an inhibitory match? Let's say within our movement, I have a representation of where my hand is now. And I want it to go here. So this is my present position. This is my target position. Then I have a volitional go signal from the basal ganglia that makes my arm move from here to here. But when I get here, I am where I want to be, so that present target minus present is 0. That's inhibitory matching. And it turns out you use that mismatch in an appropriate way to tune the circuit so that when you are where you want to be, the difference vector is 0. So first here, I can't see what I'm showing you.
Yes, I can see it. Yeah.
Here's a slide of adaptive resonance. And you can see the light green down here.
Yes.
That's the critical feature pattern. So that you have a top-down match.
Yes.
On the critical feature pattern, you go through an excitatory resonance to try to learn that. And the way that works, I forget if we're going to discuss it, is via the art matching rule.
Move it just a little bit to your left, please. Yes, like that. Yes.
So what the art matching rule shows, you see if I have bottom-up excitatory input, it can fire feature selective cells if nothing else is happening. If I activate a category and I try to read out in those spreading green adaptive pathways a critical feature pattern or prototype, I can't fully do it because I'm also activating this inhibitory off surround, which approximately balances the excitatory on center. That's how I prime. When I read out top-down expectation, there might be some subthreshold activation of the cells that got activated and a deep trough of inhibition around it. But then if I have a matching bottom-up input, it's 2 against 1, 2 excitatory, 1 bottom-up, 1 top-down, 1 inhibitory. You can start to fire, and that can lead to resonance. And I don't know if we're going to discuss that. What do you do if something unexpected happens? There's a complementary attentional system and orienting system where the learning goes on the attentional system. And if you get a big enough mismatch or novelty or unexpectedness, it activates the orienting system,
right,
which automatically discovers a better matching category or a new category to learn the new stuff. So, okay, that was a little afield. So, sorry, let's get back to your question.
So then, I mean, why do we need to understand learning then to properly understand consciousness?
Well, to summarize, my work shows that learning without catastrophic forgetting is solved by adaptive resonances, and that properties of the adaptive resonances, just after years of modeling, happen to support multiple conscious states with different functions in different parts of the brain. We reviewed some of them. All of them are supported by lots of explanations of modeling, simulations, and explanations of data. So, science is never complete, but I'm sort of baffled in a way. We live in the world of Google. You can presumably search for anything in no time at all. And yet, I've explained data from hundreds of experiments, never mentioning the word quantum, no quantum. There were quantum effects at the photoreceptors when noise hits the the ear. At the periphery, right away, our brains are designed to suppress quantum noise and to deal with it, to become deterministic. And yet today, there are still people who are promoting that, consciousness must be quantum because they don't understand it, and must be in microtubules. So how do you recite Keats out of a microtubule? That's beyond my understanding. So there's overwhelming evidence that what I'm saying is at least on the road to the truth. And the thought experiments cannot be denied because the hypotheses are familiar facts. When I grew up learning science, I thought you study the theories that explain the most data in a principled way, and nothing comes close. So I hope some people are interested in studying it. And I wrote my book in particular to be self-contained and non-technical. But that being said, we are talking about the human mind, which is perhaps the most complex system in nature that we can hope to understand scientifically. So it requires thoughtful reading. I have friends who've read it, parts of it, who know no science at all. A rabbi, a pastor, a visual artist, a gallery owner, a lawyer, a social worker, and they would read the parts that interest them. And that's possible because I wrote the chapters. So after you read the preface and introductory chapter 1, each chapter can be read independently of the others. So you don't have to try to read the whole thing. Who has that much time or interest? But if you're interested in about feelings, you can jump to the chapter about feelings.
Yes.
And so on.
So let me ask you now a little bit about the evolution of the brain. And actually, earlier, you've already touched a little bit on the idea or the proposal that some people have of modularity. But what do you think about that idea more specifically, about the idea of modularity of the brain/mind?
Well, brain anatomy is definitely specialized. There are multiple brain regions that carry out different functions like vision, audition, cognition, emotion, and so on. But the processes aren't carried out by independent modules. In fact, if you look at the famous Feldman and Van Essen macro circuit, which I had a picture of, they all interact. I can't see it when you can see it.
Yes, but I can see it, yes.
Okay, so on the one hand, in the lower right, that's the anatomical diagram by Feldman and Van Essen of the interactions in the visual system. Dense, bottom up, top down, multiple stages. Remember, hierarchical processing of uncertainty. And the bigger picture, if you could read it, gives the functions carried out by different parts of visual cortex, along with what region it is. And there are bottom up, top down, horizontal interactions. And as the figure says, the bottom up, horizontal, and top down interactions overcome complementary processing deficiencies. So if it weren't for them, those interactions, nothing could be computed effectively. And moreover, each of the processes do what one's called multiplexing information. So a visual boundary, it's not just an edge. if the famous example of a shaded ellipse, if all it was a bounding edge instead of a boundary, then the color inside would just fill in and you'd see a flat gray ellipse. But boundaries respond to edges, texture, shading, and depth. And so, in addition to hierarchical resolution of uncertainty, with all these interactions, each of the computations are multiplexing multiple properties. And as I said before, otherwise I couldn't ever learn to recognize your face. You have texture, you have shading, you have boundaries. It's all overlaid. I have to be able to deal with it holistically. Did that help there?
Mm-hmm. No, yes, that helped. And earlier, or just a minute ago, actually, you mentioned how many theories of consciousness out there, people who propose them apparently do not even look at scientific data. So, but why do you think there are so many theories of consciousness out there? And would you have a solution for how we should actually approach its study?
We all have a conscious experience, so maybe we feel entitled. But we also experience cognitive impenetrability, which means that in our daily experience, if you don't study neuroscience, you don't even know you have a brain. And for hundreds of years, people thought that our experience was in our pancreas or our liver or, So you can't introspect the answer.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't believe that a theory which discusses consciousness is a theory of consciousness unless it can show how interacting brain processes give rise to conscious psychological experiences. You have to make the link. And without a linking hypothesis between brain and mind, brain processes have no functional role, and psychological processes have no mechanistic explanation. So you're high and dry. Now, as I mentioned, I'm lucky. I started passionately studying psychology as a 17-year-old. And that drove me, because I always think in real time, into studying brain dynamics. I didn't mention, but I was driven into neural networks to explain data about verbal learning, serial verbal learning, how we learn lists of anything. And I didn't know they were neural networks. I had never studied. I was a freshman after all. Cell bodies of neurons, axons, synapses, synaptic knobs, transmitters, action potentials. They were all in my model from a psychological derivation. And it's only when I talked to pre-med friends who were studying it in their pre-med courses that I realized the things that they told me they're learning, I already knew. So you have to make that link. And from a very early age, I discovered a way to penetrate cognitive impenetrability. And people who want to know how I've done it, and others have tried to do it, they should read my book. And then if they get really interested, if you go to my webpage, which is just sites, sites.bu for Boston University.edu/Steve G, STEVEG, sites.bu.edu/Steve G. You'll see maybe 570 archival articles and quite a few videos of self-contained lectures and interviews to learn more about it in detail. But my book is a good, one place to go shopping for this information. There are 17 chapters on different stuff, and it covers a lot of stuff.
Mm-hmm. No,
So,
yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
yeah, so what makes me frustrated with some very well-known scientists I won't mention, like the quantum guys, if they could explain even a tiny fraction of the amount of data I've explained, by that I mean how brain dynamics give rise to parametric psychological experiences and data, I would think they were making a serious contribution. But they don't even try. And they never try to compare their contribution with mine, which I just feel is unscientific. It's not how I was brought up. Beyond bad manners, it's unscientific, which is a severe criticism in my lexicon.
Mm-hmm. So let's move ahead here. I think that earlier we've already touched on what consciousness is good for, and you've also explained what resonant states and resonance mean. So, I mean, another thing that people many times bring to the table when talking about consciousness, particularly the philosophers, and this is something that was coined, I guess, by David Chalmers in the 90s, is the hard problem of consciousness. Do you think that it can be solved scientifically?
Well, let me, of course, it depends how you define it. Let me just read first. Wikipedia says, and I'll quote, the hard problem of consciousness is the problem of explaining how and why we have qualia or phenomenal experiences, how sensations acquire characteristics such as colors and taste. So, to a certain extent, and we'll come back to this in a moment, all my theories do just that. Like my theory of vision is trying to explain how we see,
Mm-hmm.
Boundaries, shading, texture, color, all these properties of surfaces, paintings, and so on. But let me just give another quote from Nagel in 74. He wrote, in part, when we see, for example, we experience visual sensations, the felt quality of redness, the experience of dark and light, the quality of depth in a visual field. Other experiences go along with perception in different modalities, the sound of a clarinet, the smell of mothballs. Well, one can give a scientific explanation of what's going on in your brain when you see red, dark and light, depth,
Mm-hmm.
sounds of instruments. But no theory in science that's defined by mathematical equations, as all scientific theories to the present have, can experience the color red or any other conscious qualia. Equations don't have qualia. But in other sciences, like I love this quote, after you've read Lamb's huge treatise on hydrodynamics, you still don't know that water is wet. But you know just about everything you'd ever want to know about water and other fluids, including air, to design airplanes that fly, boats that float on the surface, submarines. You have an effective understanding of water.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that you don't know it's wet matters less and less because you can give a scientific explanation of what is happening. First, what characterizes a state of a liquid versus a gas versus a solid. through the molecular theory of gases and this and that and the other thing. So it just doesn't matter after a while. And so in my life, given what I know that I know, the fact that I'm seeing beautiful colors around me, I can understand a lot of how that is happening. And it is outside what an equation. I can give you representations of the objects and their colors and their forms and their brightnesses, but I can't say why it looks red. I can't, because an equation can't do that. And but the answer is an equation can't do that in any science. You know, there's this famous example, I hope I'm remembering it right. You know, when astronauts were coming down and landing, and they landed somewhere in, I don't know, Arizona or wherever there was a flat, arid surface. And the first thing, I guess maybe these were the first guys to the moon, I don't remember. But the anecdote is the first thing they said when they got out was the bump was there, meaning that the computation of their trajectory coming in to the atmosphere predicted there would be a little bump, and it was there. But that's not the same thing as the qualia of experiencing the bump.
Yes.
So science can be effective and useful, but I do think it's outside the province of equations to say why water feels wet. You know, we can say why a fluid has certain properties, but why it feels wet, I don't think equations can do. And if someone can, I will study them passionately. I don't see how it can be done in principle, though.
So let's talk here a little bit about some of the applications of the way you approach consciousness in your book. Before, toward the end, we talk a little bit about principles of brain design and some other general questions. So do you think that your approach to consciousness would have any implications for the way we understand mental disorders?
Well, this is one of the things I'd call an acquired taste. Just like consciousness was an acquired taste. It's not something I ever dreamed I'd have anything to offer. But so all of the neural models start by studying the brain dynamics and mental functions of normal or typical individuals, because there are vast databases on that. You know, many hundreds, thousands of scientists. Like if you go to the annual meeting of the Society for Neuroscience, I think a recent meeting at 26,000 scientists. They're all doing incredible work, huge databases. But at a certain point, I noticed that if some of the processes get imbalanced or damaged in specific ways, then I could see formal behavioral symptoms of mental disorders emerged. And, you know, I just had to notice that it was in the model. And so it's in this spirit I've so far explained behavioral symptoms based on precisely defined imbalances. Remember, complementary computing is a balancing act, or actual lesions in Alzheimer's disease, autism, Fragile X syndrome, schizophrenia, medial temporal amnesia, visual and auditory amnesia and neglect and problems of slow wave sleep. So that came in through the back door, just like all of it is. So the moral of the story for young scientists is don't look for shortcuts. Try to understand the underlying principles and designs, and then try to model it in an authentic and serious way. It's hard work. Sometimes I wasn't ready to even write down anything about a problem for 10 or 20 years until I'd accumulated enough information to be able to proceed. But then I like saying it's the gift that keeps on giving. Consciousness was part of the gift that kept on giving. Understanding a little bit of mental disorder is part of the gift that kept on giving. So if you try to get to the heart of the matter, its richness will reward you many times over. But I've been lucky because I started very young. And even though it's controversial for quite a few years before neural networks were even a thing, there were always enough people in Washington who had faith in me and the work to give us enough funding to do the work. And it's not like the kind of funding where you need 50 million to get a fancy machine. All the money that supported me paid for graduate fellowships and postdocs for people to learn from me and learn to do science with me. So it's pennies on the dollar. Was a good investment. Anyway, did that say enough about that?
And another topic that you also cover in your book is irrational decisions. What is an irrational decision exactly, and why do we make them?
Well, there are several different kinds. And let me just make a comment before I focus on one kind. In general, if a decision fails to achieve one's goal, when another decision that would achieve the goal is readily available but wasn't chosen, we may want to say they were being irrational. And just like in cognitive emotional interactions, you might have feelings about stuff and you just can't bring yourself to do it.
Yes.
And there are many factors that can cause it, including inexperience with this kind of decision making or the need to make a quick decision or under stress. There are speed accuracy trade-off problems. But the most famous psychological database concerns what's called decision making under risk. That is, decisions in situations that are uncertain because the outcomes are defined by probabilities. If you do this and that, the probability of getting this payoff is that. If you do that and this, the probability of getting that payoff is that. And which do people choose? And Danny Kahneman and Amos Tversky won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2002 for their experiments and an algebraic model they published to fit their data in 1979, explaining paradoxical properties of irrational decision-making in probabilistic environments. And their algebraic model, which is, a phenomenological model that tries to compress the description of the data and is very useful, it's called prospect theory. But then in 1987, I think my student Bill Gutowski and I went beyond it in a well-known article in Psychological Review, because my article with Bill introduced a real-time neural network model. We gave it a name because I started realizing you got to name everything. Don't need to prevent other people from plagiarizing it. You want to stop them, but at least you can say that's just affective balance theory is what we called it. That quantitatively explains and simulated the Danny Kahneman and Amos Tversky data as emergent properties. And all we did was we applied my already known cognitive emotional model to their data. So we didn't do any more modeling. We showed that their data fell out of the wash when the model was exposed to the kind of risky environments like those in prospect theory. So that, I thought, had an important lesson, that Darwinian selection does shape our mind to be adaptive, but it fails in certain environments. It can't anticipate every kind of risky environment. And in the same spirit, in chapter 17 of my book, I summarize other examples of irrational behaviors, including superstitious and self-punitive behaviors in a similar way, how in certain environments, conspiratorial thinking, sadly, how certain social environments can support conspiracy kind of ideas, which we see all too much in the United States these days, sad to say. So my abstract with Bill, I summarized a little here. Mm-hmm. These explanations illustrate that the data concerning decision-making under risk may now be related to data concerning the dynamics of conditioning, cognition, and emotion as consequences of a single psychophysiological theory. So in other words, you didn't have to build a new theory, and we explained some risky decision-making data that Kahneman and Tversky could not, like what's called preference reversal. So our theory is more powerful, both in the sense of explaining their data as emergent properties of known brain cognitive emotional dynamics, but also explaining more data because Bill, did an experiment on preference reversals. But, our paper was published in 87. Danny and Amos's was in 79. They got the Nobel Prize in 2002. We didn't share it. So go figure.
Well, so we've already also touched on or addressed the problem of cognitive impenetrability. So let's talk about something that you've alluded to in the beginning of our conversation, that is AI systems. So do you think that having a better understanding of how brains give rise to minds would also be important for designing AI systems?
Well, today, when people say the word AI, they usually mean neural networks, which wasn't the case when AI was symbolic. Marvin Minsky realized he had to get on the gravy train. In fact, there's a funny anecdote about that. Marvin Minsky and Seymour Papert, when they were doing symbolic AI, they were at MIT and I was an assistant professor. And they really attacked me brutally because I was doing neural networks. And Marvin, when he was a young man, tried to do neural networks and he failed. And since Marvin was the smartest man in the world, how can this little dipshit kid be allowed to do neural networks? They attacked me. Anyway, years later, after I'd founded and became first president of the International Neural Network Society and the archival journal Neural Networks, and I was editor-in-chief for many years, I had a lot of influence over the organization of international conferences on neural networks. And I said, let's invite Marvin Minsky, because he had just written his book, Society of Mind, which basically was just plagiarism. But hey, that was nothing new for the people in Tech Square. And I figured, let's hear what Marvin has to say. Sadly, Marvin never prepared. But he got up and the first thing he said was, there are two things I regret in my life. One was I underestimated Grossberg. And then the rest of his presentation was telling jokes. He wasn't prepared, poor Marvin. He was such an egotist. Amazing. You know, he did some useful earlier work and then he just, you know, shoveled in the gelt. Anyway, what can I say? So my neural networks illustrate autonomous adaptive intelligence. And not all neural networks do. So I was trying to say, now when people say neural networks or AI, they usually mean deep learning. And I published a paper a few years ago, because I was invited to, where I explained why deep learning is untrustworthy because it's not explainable. If you make a prediction using deep learning, and let's say it's a medical prediction, and someone dies as a result, and the surviving family are grief-stricken, and they say, why did you tell the doctor to do that? And your answer would be, I don't know. You're going to be sued out for everything you're worth. So it's untrustworthy because it's unexplainable, and it's unreliable because it can experience catastrophic forgetting. In fact, in 1988, I wrote a off-cited paper that I review in my magnum opus with 17 problems that backpropagation, which deep learning uses as its learning engine, still has, that art never had, and yet they still choose not to use it. So deep learning is deeply flawed. And then ChatGPT, you know, with generative AI, I mean, you know, they've thrown into it immense databases. They scrub the internet. And so perhaps not surprisingly, it can generate a lot of phrases and sentences that sound intelligent. But basically, you know, it starts with a sentential context and has a probabilistic algorithm for trying to guess what to say next. The foundational problems are it has no goals, it has no meaning, and it literally does not know what it's talking about, literally. And in fact, on the Connectionists website, now I don't know if you follow it, there's been this very heated discussion of this attack on AI of this kind, led by Gary Marcus, who's a professor at NYU. And everything they're saying against it is correct. But I believe the future of humanity will benefit from an AI that is increasingly autonomous, adaptive, and intelligent in its algorithms, machines, and mobile robots, especially ones that embody brain-inspired designs, because these are the ones that can seamlessly interact in brain-machine cooperative ventures. And I'm the guy who's led that, and we're well on the way to it. In terms of meaning, you know, I don't want to presume that everything's understood. In fact, just last year, I published an article on my webpage about how children learn in real time from their parents and other teachers, to learn affective and perceptual language meanings. It's not in my book. I wasn't ready to write that paper till last year. And that's just the beginning of what has to be a huge research program that I clearly will not live to see completed. But at least now there's that foundation. You can't say, as people in AI used to do all the time, we're the best game in town. They've never been the best game in town, but they spend so much time marketing, whereas people like me spend so much time thinking and writing and discovering. I can't do that. That's not why I want to stay alive. Yeah. So should I say, maybe I'll say, the best example of autonomous adaptive intelligence is the human mind. We're autonomous because we can act on our own. We're adaptive because we can learn throughout life, because we solve the stability plasticity dilemma. And we're intelligent, at least in the sense that we can, as a species, make wise enough decisions and plans to create civilizations, even though we can be superstitious, conspiratorial, terribly cruel and violent as well. And the end of my book discusses, why they're in, there's a kind of yin yang in the human mind, and good and evil are built right into us. But I also try to clarify why good has a leg up. Because bad things usually punished and either suppressed or avoided. Whereas good things can be sustained and you can build beautiful things, important, useful things on them. So there's a broken symmetry in evolution between good and evil, and our lives depend on it.
So talking about good and evil, and you also mentioned a little bit earlier superstition, does the approach that you present in the book also have implications for how we understand things like morality, religion, creativity, and the human condition, where I guess many of these topics are traditionally approached in philosophy, right?
Yeah, well, remember that Newton thought he was doing natural philosophy.
Yeah.
When you do deep science, it gets philosophical, deep philosophical. Well, I want to do a quote. Chapter 17 of my book lightly discusses some of these things. They could be discussed much more extensively. On page 621, the header of this section in question is more or less what I was just talking about, symmetry breaking of positive and negative in cognition and emotion, a reason for hope. I think hope is an important word, and especially in our crazy world. Let me just quote it, it's not too long. As with all predictive behaviors, there are cognitive and emotional reasons for morality that are built into the most basic properties of our brains. In both cognition and emotion, there is, I'll argue, a broken symmetry between positive and negative processes, with the positive emphasized because it is just a broken symmetry. Much as every source of light can cast a shadow, both good and evil deeds are possible, although I would claim there's a built-in bias toward the good, so that values aren't purely relative. And as I was just indicating, an example of the broken symmetry is that bad deeds are punished, and punishment suppresses behavior, which causes us to avoid them. And if you don't avoid them, you end up in jail or worse. Whereas good deeds are rewarded and thus can be sustained and built upon. And I believe in that very much. You know, it's a broken symmetry. That's not very romantic, but I think understanding it, you know, you don't have to understand much more than on the level I said, is very clarifying. A lot of our development and evolution due to broken symmetries. You know, and just look at us, we're bilaterally symmetric.
Yeah.
But it's broken. You know, we have a dominant hemisphere in our cortex. We can be right-handed or left-handed. So we are broken, but we are symmetric. And it's built into everything. And I believe that a lot of the origin of the universe, although I shouldn't talk about things I know nothing about. Not that I know nothing, but I think a lot of broken symmetries drove evolution.
We've already also talked earlier about the brain design principles that you go through in the book, complementarity, uncertainty, and resonance. So perhaps let's go back to the very beginning of our conversation when I asked you about when psychology/neuroscience and physics diverged in terms of their approach to the brain and the mind. Do you think that the paradigm you present in your book can help unify them again?
Well, let me quote again from my book, and then if maybe I'll make some other comments. On pages 635 and 636, again, chapter 17. As I explained in chapter 5, brains can also bind into coherent moments of conscious experience within a unified self. Measurements taken from multiple physical sources, light, sound, pressure, temperature, bodily biochemical processes, and the like. So like when someone asks, how do you feel today? You can tell them all sorts of stuff. And it's not just like, you know, I have a light meter, a sound meter, a pressure meter. It's all unified into a coherent moment of conscious awareness. So the brain is thus a universal, remember I talked a little about that, self-organizing measurement system of the world and in the world. Chapter 1 explained that due to this universal measurement process, brains may play a role that'll be compared with the role played in physics by Max Planck's law of black body radiation. Because by describing a radiation spectrum that's universal across all matter, Planck's law ushered in quantum mechanics, whereby to explain all subatomic phenomena, the brain's universal measurement process can be expected to have a comparable impact on future science. So, you know, our brains don't function when it comes to cognition, emotion, et cetera, on a quantum level. You know, even if there are noisy fluctuations in individual cells, often cell populations have mean activities that are much larger than the variance. So we can have a kind of deterministic or mean field dynamic equations for our brain dynamics that's not operating with quantum fluctuations needed to be considered. But we have this universality in terms of all these physical fields as a measurement device that's self-organizing. And I also, in chapter 17, talk about how some of these principles, like complementarity, uncertainty, and resonance, operate even in single non-neural cells, very primitive cell types that have existed long before humans. So there is a universal developmental code in which art, adaptive resonance, is part of that larger code. It is one example of the kind of resonance that you find even in morphogenesis of very simple species. So, I talk about the kind of resonance that occurs when a blastula becomes a gastrula. I talk about, read the book. I'm getting a little worn out at my search, and my brain isn't. So there is a universal developmental code that that includes the things that we experience when our brains start actually enabling us to remember what we know about the world. And resonance goes way, way back in morphogenesis. And, I've always thought, but, maybe if someone makes this precise or shows it's wrong, I've always thought of the double helix as an example of complementary computing. And, Barbara McClintock got the Nobel Prize for showing it's very dynamic. So, if that is properly thought of as an example of complementary computing, there are many examples of this kind of complementarity throughout all of life, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And as I say, so for example, some of the competitive dynamics I discuss, like mass action, recurrent on-center off-surround networks, competition is universal, not only when you think of it on the species level a la Darwin, but it also occurs at every level of cellular organization. So the aggregation of slime molds is an example of a competitive dynamic with an on-center off-surround recurrent network. So there are these universal computational principles that are not only about us, that are also about all living things. And, when I read theoretical physics, which I've been doing since I was a boy, I see what I view as physical versions of on-center off-surround networks, galaxy, as it were. It's a balancing act, but I can't say anything useful about that.
So let me just ask you one last question then, and I want to ask you this because I actually found it very interesting that you talk about this in the book. And whenever people in science talk about laws, many times people get upset about talking about laws that are not laws of physics. Laws of biology, psychology, or whatever. People are not usually very fond of that. But do you think that we can actually talk about laws of cell biology?
Well, cell biology is vast, and these days, cell biology usually means genetics. And I'm not a geneticist, although I did just make a very speculative comment about the double helix. So I'm not sure what context to put the question. You know, it is part of cell biology, what I said about slime mold aggregation, their cells, their biology, the growth of hydra's heads, their cells, its biology. In that sense, there are examples of shared laws, you know, gastrulation, it's cell biology. It's not in a brain. There is no brain yet. So I feel, you know, even my work has shown that what I'm doing is a special case of more general laws that you can see reflected in examples of cells in biology. But if what you mean is genetics, then I'm not a geneticist, but it does strike me that the double helix, and for all I know, it's being done. Maybe the stuff that Barbara McClintock got started is maybe being studied very actively, and I just don't read about it in terms of the dynamics of those complementary strands. You know, complementary computing generally gives you a form of stability. You know, the yin and the yang alone aren't enough, but together and bound by the right kind of feedback, they can give you stable organization, just like with the boundaries and surfaces. For example, like with the Watt and West streams, one of the great triumphs of the Watt stream, which I try to explain through models, is how you develop invariant recognition categories: size invariant, view invariant, position invariant. So I could recognize you from any view, distance, angle, you know. But the problem with being position invariant is at the place where you're computing this in the anterior of inferotemporal cortex, I have no idea where your face is in space. And that's so that's in the Watt stream. The West stream gives a spatial representation. So you have to be able to go from an invariant representation into the Watt stream into a variant position representation in the West stream. And I explain how that happens. But by themselves, you know, you'd have positions without objects, and objects you didn't know where they are. So each of them is useful and important, but it's not enough for survival. So complementary computing on every level of our brains is necessary for survival. And it may very well be at every level of cell biology. But I'm not a person who studied non-brain cell systems for long enough to make a strong comment. I'd love to know more about it. Maybe I'll do more of that in my remaining years. I don't know.
Well, there are many other topics that, of course, we could cover here because the book is massive and very detailed. And again, it is the conscious mind, resonant brain, how each brain makes a mind. And I'm leaving a link in the description to it. And I hope that my audience runs and buys it. It's a very interesting book. And Steve, apart from the book, would you like to tell people where they can find you and your work on the internet?
Oh, yes. So I had mentioned once, but let me say again, I have a personal web page, sites, SITES, dot bu.edu. So sites Boston University Education / Steve G, STEVEG. All my articles can be downloaded from there, and quite a few interviews and some videos of keynote lectures on different topics. And if anyone wants to write me with a question about my work, my email is simple. It's just Steve, STEVE, at bu.edu, steve@bu.edu. So I love to discuss science, and what can I say? I started 67 years ago, and I'm still at it. And that's a testimony not only to my good luck, but to really respect the foundations of what I was studying and not go for shortcuts. And they've thrust me forward, so I never hit a brick wall. And I've loved every minute of it, even though it's been really hard work.
Well, and thank you so much for that work. And it's been an immense pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you so much for accepting the invitation.
Thank you for inviting me. And I'll look forward to getting the URL for it so I can hope I don't cringe too much.
No, it was great. It was great. So thank you again.
My pleasure.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sundo, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Mikkel Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Ford, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardus France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Lowacki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry D. Lee Jr., Old Erringbone, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers: Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Giancarlo Montenegro, Alni Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.